Chapter 6. The Phantasmatic Real. Is, however, this phantasmatic spectrality, as opposed to social reality, actually identical to the Lacanian real? Eric Santner's discussion of the Freudian figure of Moses provides an excellent description of the way spectrality operates in ideology. What is in fact traumatic about this figure, about the Jewish break with the pagan pre-monotheistic cosmo-religion of one nature, in which a multitude of deities can coexist, is not simply the monotheistic repression of pagan enjoyment, sacred orgies, images, but the excessively violent nature of the very gesture of repressing the pagan universe and imposing the universal rule of the one of law. In other words, the repressed of Jewish monotheism is not the wealth of pagan sacred orgies and deities, but the disavowed excessive nature of its own fundamental gesture. That is, to use the standard terms, the crime that founds the rule of the law itself, the violent gesture that brings about a regime which retroactively makes this gesture itself illegal, criminal. Santner refers here to the well-known paradox of, "There are no cannibals in our tribe. We ate the last one yesterday," conceiving Moses as the exemplary figure of such a last cannibal abolishing the condition of cannibalism, and in contrast, the figure of Jesus as the last meal, the last victim to be slaughtered and eaten, following Girard, who has conceived Christ's crucifixion as the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. Consequently, one should distinguish between symbolic history, the set of explicit mythical narratives and ideologico-ethical prescriptions that constitute the tradition of a community, what Hegel would have called its ethical substance, and its obscene other, the unacknowledgeable, spectral, phantasmatic history that effectively sustains the explicit symbolic tradition, but has to remain foreclosed if it is to be operative. What Freud endeavors to reconstitute in Moses and monotheism, the story of the murder of Moses, etc., is such a spectral history that haunts the space of Jewish religious tradition. Santner uses a very precise formulation which immediately recalls Lacan's definition of the real as impossible from his seminar Encore. The spectral phantasmatic history tells the story of a traumatic event that continues not to take place, that cannot be inscribed into the very symbolic space it brought about by its intervention. As Lacan would have put it, the spectral traumatic event ne cesse pas de ne pas s'écrire, doesn't stop or cease, not being written, not to inscribe itself. And of course, precisely as such, as non-existent, it continues to persist. That is, its spectral presence continues to haunt the living. One becomes a full member of a community, not simply by identifying with its explicit symbolic tradition, but when one also assumes the spectral dimension that sustains this tradition, the undead ghosts that haunt the living, the secret history of traumatic fantasies transmitted between the lines, through its lacks and distortions. In the Jewish tradition, there is a well-known story of a rabbi narrating to a young pupil the legend of a prophet to whom a divine vision appeared. When the youngster eagerly asks him, "Is this true? Did it really happen?" the rabbi answers, "It probably didn't really happen, but it is true." In the same way, the murder of the primordial father and other Freudian myths are in a way more real than reality. They are true, although of course they didn't really take place. Their spectral presence sustains the explicit symbolic tradition. Referring to Ian Hacking's recent work, Santner draws a fine line of separation from the standard notion of the change in the narrative network which allows us to tell the coherent story of our past. When one changes from one narrative register to another, that in a way allows us to rewrite the past, the emergence of the new descriptive vocabulary has to foreclose, repress the traumatic excess of its own violent imposition, the vanishing mediator between the old discursive regime and the new. And this vanishing mediator, precisely insofar as it remains non-integrated, excluded, continues to haunt actual history as its spectral other scene. This foreclosed, primordially repressed myth that grounds the rule of logos, is thus not simply a past event, but a permanent spectral presence, an undead ghost that has to persist all the time if the present symbolic frame is to remain operative. One should not confound this primordially repressed myth, this fundamental fantasy, with the multitude of inconsistent daydreams that always accompany our symbolic commitments, allowing us to endure them. Let us recall the example of a straight sexual relationship. The success of Peter Hoeg's The Woman and the Ape indicates that sex with an animal is today's predominant form of the fantasy of full sexual relationship, and it is crucial that this animal is, as a rule, male. In contrast to cyborg sex fantasy, in which the cyborg is, as a rule, a woman, Blade Runner, that is, in which the fantasy is that of woman-machine, the animal is a male ape copulating with a human woman and fully satisfying her. Does this not materialize two standard common daydreams? That of a woman who wants a strong animal partner, a potent beast, not a hysterical, impotent weakling, and that of a man who wants his female partner to be a perfectly programmed doll who fulfills all his wishes, not a living being. What we should do in order to penetrate the underlying fundamental fantasy is to stage these two fantasies together, to confront ourselves with the unbearable ideal couple of a male ape copulating with a female cyborg, the phantasmatic support of the normal couple of man and woman copulating. The need for this redoubling, the need for this phantasmatic supplement to accompany the straight sexual act as a spectral shadow, is yet another proof that there is no sexual relationship. Do we not find something quite similar in the superb final scene of My Best Friend's Wedding, when, at the wedding of Cameron Diaz, Julia Roberts, her best friend, who, throughout the film, has been trying to abort this wedding in order to win the bridegroom, her ex-boyfriend, back, resigned to the loss of her ex-partner, accepts the proposal of Rupert Everett, her close gay friend, and performs a passionate dance act with him in front of all the wedding guests. They are the true couple, to be opposed to the official real couple of Cameron Diaz and her bridegroom, engaged in a full, straight sexual relationship. What is crucial here is that Julia Roberts and Rupert Everett, in contrast to this actual couple, are not engaged in sex. Although they just put on a spectacle, although they are engaged in performing a fake appearance, it is precisely as such that their performance is, in a way, more real than the common reality of the actual sex of the other people. In short, this dance is sublime in the strict Kantian sense. What the two of them stage, what appears, shines through their act, is the fantasy, the impossible utopian dream of the ultimate perfect couple that the other actual couple will never be able to come close to. So again, the gesture of Roberts and Everett is to stage the impossible fantasy whose spectre accompanies and redoubles the true couple engaged in actual sex. And the paradox is that they can do it precisely insofar as they are not an actual couple, precisely insofar as, because of their different sexual orientations, their relationship can never be consummated. The lesson of all this is that, in the opposition between fantasy and reality, the real is on the side of fantasy. Nowhere is this clearer than in the standard Hollywood procedure, under the pressure of the Hays Code censorship rules, of retroactively transposing the main narrative into a nightmarish dream, so that at the end of the film, when the catastrophe is at its peak, we return to normal, everyday reality. To avoid the standard examples, from Robert Wiener's Dr. Caligari to Fritz Lang's Woman in the Window, let us turn to Robert Siodmak's The Strange Affair of Uncle Harry, 1945. In an online all-movie guide, this film is qualified as okay for children, but the key words used to characterize its plot are incest, kill, romance, schemer, sister. An excellent example of how the innocent reading can coexist with much more unsettling undertones. Even more than The Woman in the Window, Uncle Harry plays on the paradoxes of desire and its realization. John Quincy, an unmarried middle-aged fabric designer, played in a superb case of anti-casting by the sinister George Sanders, lives a dull life with his two domineering unmarried sisters, the older Hester and the younger Letty, who look after him in their family manor in New Hampshire. He meets Deborah Brown, a visiting fashion expert from New York City. Soon their friendship becomes love, and he asks her to marry him. When Deborah meets John's family, and the sisters are informed of their plan to marry, Hester is happy for her brother, while Letty is violently jealous and feigns a heart attack. Frustrated and angry at Letty's attempt to spoil his happiness, John plans to murder her by poisoning her regular drink. Through a mistake, however, it is Hester who drinks the cup intended for Letty and dies. Although she is aware that the poison was for her, Letty assumes the guilt and is condemned to death for her sister's murder. Although John publicly protests that he did the poisoning, she refuses to corroborate his self-incrimination, because she knows that her death will prevent him from marrying Deborah. She tells him, "I'll give you what you always wanted, your freedom from me," aware that in this way she will make him indebted to her forever, since he will owe his freedom to her. By taking the guilt upon herself and letting him live, she changes the rest of his life into the vegetation of a living dead. In short, Letty takes his desire to kill her upon herself, and thus frustrates him by fulfilling it. At the very end of the film, John wakes up and discovers that the entire catastrophic situation of his poisoning his sister has been his dream. What awakens him is the returning Deborah, and he merrily elopes with her to New York, leaving his two sisters behind. The paradox, of course, is that this very fictionalization of the murder, to mollify the senses, introduces an additional element of pathology. The film's final lesson is that the most disturbed psyche in the film may actually have been that of the protagonist. Does not the fact that instead of simply confronting his sister like a mature adult, he dreams of an elaborate poisoning scheme, reveal his profound guilt of his sexual attraction to her? The retroactive fictionalization engages the subject who generated this fiction much more fundamentally than if he were really to poison his sister. If we were dealing with a real-life murder case, John would ultimately have been the victim of some externally imposed situation, of the unfortunate fact of having a domineering and possessive sister. That is, it would have been possible for him and us, spectators, to put the blame on circumstances, while the fictionalization of the murder attempt anchors the narrative events much more strongly in John's own libidinal tendencies. In other words, is not the underlying premise of this fictionalization that John himself sustains the privileged intimate relationship with Letty, that Letty's dominant role satisfies John's own libidinal needs, and that his aggressive acting out, his attempt to murder her, is also directed at the real of his own unacknowledged passionate attachment? Did he not dream about his murderous act in order to avoid the happy prospect, rejected by his unconscious, of abandoning the incestuous link with Letty and marrying Deborah? When at the end he wakes up, he does so in order to escape the horrible prospect of the realization of his desire in all its fundamental ambiguity, since this realization implies that the fundamental passionate attachment that structured his life is undone. He gets rid of the obstacle and is simultaneously even more indebted to his sister.